introduce Paul Thagard from Waterloo, not very far away, and he will be speaking about conceptual change in the brain revolution.
Thanks. I'm very grateful to have the chance to attend this meeting. The talks have been really interesting over the last couple of days, and I get the opportunity to tie together two lines of research that I've been involved with for a long time, but rarely connect. So one line of research is on theoretical models of neural networks. I've been doing that since the 80s, work on topics like analogy and coherence and creativity and priming and most recently emotions and consciousness. But I also have another line of research that I've been doing since the 80s, which is on conceptual change, looking at questions in the history and philosophy of science that interconnect with psychological issues about developmental psychology and educational psychology. So I'm going to try to put them together by looking at the kinds of conceptual change that seem to me to be involved in the sort of theoretical developments that have occurred. It's been very interesting over the last couple of days hearing lots of suggestions about changes on ontology that might be suggested by experimental work, which I think is really important. But it's also important to see that the change in the basic concepts. Wait a minute. Okay. Yeah, it's okay. I'll take this out. I'll be fine. Wow. Okay, my talk's over now. So to try to put these things together to figure out what are the main kinds of conceptual change going on with these theoretical developments, which I think mesh quite nicely with the experimental developments we've been hearing about. So I'm going to take conceptual change to mean the same as ontological change, to mean the same thing as taxonomic change, but I'll say some things that will justify that identification. But first let me tell you a story. So a man walks into a movie theater and he sees that a woman comes in with a dog. And the dog climbs up on the seat, and when the movie starts, the dog actually seems to be paying attention to the screen. In fact, at one point there's a joke, the dog is laughing. At another point, somebody gets killed, the dog is sobbing. And then finally, the movie ends with a great exciting crescendo, and the dog is jumping up and down. So the man runs after the woman as she's leaving and said, "Excuse me, I was amazed your dog actually seemed to be enjoying the movie." And the woman says, "I was surprised too, he hated the book." Okay. So a lot of people are surprised at the idea that the mind might be the brain, but I think the evidence is pointing out to that. We want to try to figure out what's going on there. And one of the changes were taking place is questions about emotions, so I'll be talking about that too. So I'm going to talk a bit about what I think the brain revolution is and why it, in fact, ranks up with some of the major revolutions in the history of science. Of course, it's a little hard to comment on it because we're in the middle of it. And so it's not quite like what the Chinese leader, I think it was Deng Xiaoping, said when he was asked, "What do you think is the significance of the French Revolution?" And he said, "It's too soon to tell." Well, there he had a couple hundred years to think about it. We're in the middle. It's sort of like talking about the Darwinian revolution in 1865, a few years after Darwin published The Origin. So we'll try to figure it out. So I'm going to say something about what I think concepts are, which I think is important because I think of taxonomies as consisting of concepts. And I'll be fleshing it out with some new ideas from theoretical neuroscience due to my colleague Chris Elias-Smith, ideas about semantic pointers, because I think it's very useful for understanding a lot of the important theoretical changes that need to take place. And then I'll use that to talk about different kinds of conceptual change, drawing on my old ideas from looking at all the major scientific revolutions, and then show how they also apply in changes that are taking place right now in neuroscience and psychology. And then I'll have time, I hope, to indicate specifically about how the semantic theory, pointer theory of emotions, can help to illuminate a lot of these things. So my quote here is from Keynes. The difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones. One of the things that can help for escaping from the old ones is to realize what the old ones were and how they contrast with the new ones. And you want to have a difference between old and new ideas, and I'll try to do some of that as well. Okay, so what's the brain revolution? Neuroscience is having a huge impact in all areas of psychology. Initially it was cognitive psychology, but now there's big impacts on social, developmental, and clinical psychology. So there's ways in which people are trying to use neuroscience techniques, neuroscientific theoretical ideas to illuminate those other fields. But that's not the only comparison, because we want to think of the brain revolution as revolutionary with respect to the view of ordinary people, folk psychology. And this I think, is actually enormous. Folk psychology is inherently dualist. How do I know that? Well, because there are around 7 billion people in the world, and 5 billion of them belong to religions that believe in the afterlife. The main ones are Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism and Buddhism. They believe that when your body dies, you go on. If you take emotions, for example, if you're going to be happy in heaven or sad in hell, well, your brain's gone, but emotions continue. So definitely going to see cognitive neuroscience as revolutionary radically for folk psychology, and for some kinds of philosophy, such as phenomenology, which supposes that the main way you can study the mind is by some kind of introspection. I also think that neuroscience is moderately revolutionary with respect to standard ways of doing information processing psychology, what became popular in the 1960s and 70s and continues to some days, and also for a lot of the ways in which analytic philosophers, analytic philosophy of mind, has talked about the mind since the 20th century. So let's see how this goes. Well, first of all, in order to figure out what a taxonomy is, taxonomies consist of concepts, ontologies consist of concepts. Well, what are concepts? Well, here we've already, I think, got a major kind of conceptual change because if you followed cognitive psychology at all, the field was kind of a mess. I mean, nobody has for a long time has bought into the standard view that concepts have definitions, but what they are instead hasn't been clear at all. A good illustration of this is in Greg Murphy's book, The Big Book of Concepts, where he gives loads of studies that support exemplar views of concepts, loads of studies that support prototype theories of concepts, loads of views that suggest that it's explanations that are matter, but it just all looked like what was the right sort of theory? Well, I'm happy to say we've got a new theory of concepts. This is work of people at Waterloo with Peter Blau as the first author and Chris Elias-Smith coming out, where we try to use new ideas about neural representations to provide a theory of concepts that actually synthesizes all these things. We can actually simulate the kinds of studies that supported exemplar and prototype and explanation views of concepts. So this is really a different way of thinking about what concepts are, certainly compared to folk psychology, that concepts are things in the head or some kinds of abstract entities. It also provides a different way of thinking about from the way that early information processing views of concepts suggested that they were some kinds of computational structure. Instead, the big conceptual change here is to think of concepts as patterns of neural firing that can handle all the different kinds of phenomena that psychologists have talked about with respect to exemplars and typical features and explanations. So from now on, when I talk about conceptual change or changes in taxonomy, I'm going to be thinking of concepts in this sense already involving a conceptual change, a shift to thinking of concepts as these kinds of neural patterns. This is all relying on ideas about semantic pointers developed by my colleague Chris Elias-Smith. So if you want to look at big shifts, you've got to look at best current theories on top of the great experimental studies we heard about. But this, quite honestly, I think is the best theoretical idea in computational neuroscience these days. And what makes it so powerful is that he managed to synthesize ideas that have been around in cognitive science since the field began in the 50s. So back in the 50s, when Herbert Simon and other people started to try to think about how intelligence could be something that operates in a computer, and thinking of the mind as a computer, the basic idea is that intelligence is the processing of physical symbols. A very powerful idea carried over from logic, but making it computational. And it's still successful in explaining a lot of different kinds of thinking that people do. But in the 1980s, a different idea came around. I'll use the pseudo-Hegelian terminology here and call it the antithesis. It's the idea that, no, that's not right, that it's not the symbol processing that really does things. It's what's going on below that level, that it's when you've got neural networks where you don't have one neuron just being a symbol, but a whole bunch of neurons working together in a distributed representation, and that's, in fact, the basis for intelligence. And this view has been extremely successful at explaining lots of different kinds of interesting phenomena as well. I never saw these as alternatives because it seemed to me that the way in which the brain works is going to be obviously using the sub-symbolic processes and the distributed representations, but also should be able to handle the kinds of symbolic reasoning that we use sometimes also. Well, people have tried to put it together in various ways, but I think Chris is really the first person who succeeded. And so the idea is that you can get neural networks, really powerful ones that are neurologically plausible, unlike the old connectionist ideas from the 80s, that are capable of symbolic processes using this cool idea he called a semantic pointer. So what are semantic pointers? Well, to begin with, they're patterns of neural firing. It's really important that the neurons aren't just firing at different rates, they're also firing in different patterns. And they can do a bunch of really valuable things. So what makes them semantic is they can handle two kinds of meaning. They can handle meaning that's both a matter of symbol to symbol type meanings, but also symbol to world type meanings. And the way they do this is, well, Chris calls it shallow meaning. I don't think it's that shallow, but you get symbol-like relations to the world and other representations. But they do it by means of incorporating sensory motor information. They're embodied in that sense that the way you build up the semantic pointers is partly through perceptual information coming in from your senses, motor information about what your body is doing, and I think emotional information is important as well. But despite the fact that it's got this connection to sensory motor operations, you nevertheless can do syntax. You can do deduction, you can do abductive inference, you can do parse language, you can parse grammars, because it turns out that this kind of neural representation is powerful enough to do that. And you can also handle the flow of information through the system to accomplish its goals. So in one neat neural package, you get semantics, syntax, and pragmatics, all interactive in the way that I think is really quite nice. I mean, standard view coming from formal logic and computer science is, well, it's basically a syntactic engine, and then you build the semantics on top of that, and then you build the pragmatics on that if you ever get around to talking about it. But in fact, if you're dealing with a system that's working in the world, it's very important to have semantics and syntax and pragmatics in an elegant package, and I think that's what the semantic pointer architecture does. So let me give you a really brief idea about what semantic pointers are. I should have pointed out that this idea is really new. First publication was in Science in 2012, where Chris and his gang presented the largest neural network simulation to date. It was 2.5 million neurons. As far as I know, it's still the largest one. And then Chris developed the ideas in his 2013 book. And so that's what you should look for if you want an actual mathematical, careful analysis. I'm giving you the semantic pointers for poets versions today. Been really interesting developments since then. One of the major developments is getting this all to run on neuromorphic chips. So neuromorphic chips are ones that are not just standard ones you find in a digital computer, but well, they're digital, but they're trying to make the chips operate like neurons, so you can get 1 million neurons on a chip. And there are 4 places in the world that are leading now in the development of these kinds of chips. One's IBM, one is the Brain Project in Switzerland. The other 2 are at Stanford and Manchester, and the Stanford and Manchester books are both using Chris's software to operate their chips. And it's really big advantages because now he took that simulation with 2.5 million neurons, took days to run on a bunch of standard computers, but now they can run it on these neuromorphic chips from Manchester, and it can control robots in real time. So it's getting inputs and outputs and operating really quite nicely. So it's computationally very powerful. I also think it's psychologically quite powerful for the reasons I'll start to describe and indicate that as part of what I think is revolutionary in neuroscience these days. So what does the semantic pointer do? Well, it binds together a whole bunch of information. The idea of binding has been familiar in cognitive science since the 60s. People realized that for perception, you need to be able to not just see a collection of different kinds of experiences, but for example, to see my device here as black and long and thin, and you put these all things together. In the semantic pointer architecture, binding isn't done by neural synchrony. It's done by a neat mathematical operation called convolution that Chris managed to show how to do in neurons. So what goes into it? Well, you can have sensory information, as I mentioned. Think of these circles here not as 6 neurons, but as 6,000 neurons or 6 million neurons all interacting together. But the way in which you get the semantic pointer, the pattern of firing, is you've got representation of sensory information, eyes, ears, so on, motor information, moving things around. I have also added into the picture emotional information coming from internal the body and other aspects I'll talk about shortly. And in the case of humans, where you got language, you can have verbal information bound into it. So all of these things can be bound into a neural representation that can do really cool things. So this gives you some idea what the functions of semantic pointers can do, because you can actually use them to make inferences. because you can relate one semantic pointers to the other. You can even make rules out of them. You can have a rule that might be something that sounds verbal, like if you meet somebody, then shake hands. Well, that's partly a verbal rule, but it's also meeting somebody involves a visual experience, maybe an emotional experience, and the then part is motor, well, shake their hands, you've got the movement. And so you can build these semantic pointers into rules, but you can also not treat them just as visual symbols that have thrown away the relevant information. You can also unpack them, take them apart, and so you can get the sensory motor information back out of it. And so you haven't done what normally happens in robots where you throw away all the inputs. You actually maintain some of the patterns of firing that went into the sensory motor information and bind that into the semantic pointer in ways that can be put to use in very complex inferences, even for imagination, but you can also take it apart. You're not losing the sensory motor information. That's an important part of it, or the emotional information either. Okay, so that's what I think concepts are. So now I can say what I think a taxonomy is. Now here, I'm not going to give a definition of taxonomy, because one interesting consequence of this theory of concepts, if it's correct, is you get a different view of what conceptual analysis is. In philosophy, the standard view of conceptual analysis is give definitions. And of course, it never works, but people keep trying to do it anyway. Well, I think this theory of concepts indicates why it never works, because that's not how concepts work outside of some narrow areas like mathematics. So if concepts are in fact these neural processes that bind together exemplars, typical features, and explanations, then what a conceptual analysis should be, in fact, should specify these different things. So the way I'm going to tell you what a taxonomy is by telling you what are exemplars, what are typical features, and what are our explanations. So we got lots of exemplars of taxonomies. People have talked about various ontologies here. You get them from biology, scientific biology as well. Wikipedia is implicitly a kind of taxonomy because it's organized in concepts that are related to each other by kind relations. The idea of ontology, some philosophers might have been confused because ontology in philosophy traditionally means the study of the nature of reality, whereas in computer science and informatics it's taken on this different meaning of a conceptual system that has some relation to reality. So computer ontologies, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatric Disorders that we've talked about, those are all exemplars. But what are the typical features? Here, I'm not going to try to give necessary and sufficient conditions, since that's always fails, but you've got different domains that the taxonomy is about. It always includes concepts, kind of tree structure, although sometimes that can be messy. What it does is classification. What's the explanatory role? Why do we want to have this idea of taxonomy? Well, it explains how people make classifications and how they make inferences. So it's very useful. But I think and also part of what goes into sophisticated theoretical concepts is we want to be able to explain how they work. What are they explained by? And here we can look at psychological processes of concept formation and classification, which, given the current state of theoretical neuroscience, can actually be understood as neural processes. So that's my three analysis of taxonomy. Okay, so now we can get into an account of conceptual change. And here, this is something I've worked out a lot over the years, and I've identified 6 different kinds of conceptual change, or taxonomic change if you want. And I think all of them are operating in the brain revolution. But now let me give you an idea of what they are. The original setup for this was in a book I published 1 million years ago, updated in 2012 with some more examples, especially from medicine. The most recent paper is quite, I think, interesting from the point of view of both history of science and philosophy of mind. It's called Explanatory Identities. I wrote it because I wanted to think about well, what is actually involved if mind-brain identity is right? How do you justify that kind of claim? And of course, there's various philosophers who have given thought experiments to show that mind-brain identity can't be right. And there's standard responses that people like Paul and Pat Churchill have done to say, well, but if that argument worked for mind-brain identity, it would also show that things like lightning is electromagnetism couldn't be right. But I decided to do it more systematically. So I looked at 15 examples of concepts from the ancient Greeks, or concepts that are around since the ancient Greeks, and looked at the way in which they have actually been shown to be right. We now know, for example, that salt is sodium chloride, and lightning is electromagnetic activity, and water is H2O. And I went through these 15 examples to identify the kinds of conceptual change that operates in there. So that's more support for this general scheme that I'm giving you here. So how do you get conceptual change happening, changes in taxonomies? One, of course, is addition of new concepts. This happens all the time. This isn't a very exciting conceptual change because it isn't at all revolutionary, but that's going to be part of it, adding in new ideas like atom and so on. Where conceptual change gets really interesting is when you delete concepts, when you discover that you've got old ideas that are just getting in the way and you've got to eliminate them. So Aristotle's ether, no longer around. Caloric, which was thought to be the element that was the basis for heat, that's no longer around. So lots of other things. Phlogiston's no longer around. So deletion occurs as well. Another kind of conceptual change that's less radical but sometimes important is differentiations. That's where when you've got a concept and you divide it into, and you realize that in fact there's different subkinds that are really quite important. So back in the 19th century, infection was a category, a kind. But then people realized, oh, there's different kinds of infections. Once you understood what the causal basis of, there's bacterial infections, there's viral infections, there's fungal infections, and so you differentiate there. Same with clouds. We know a lot more about different kinds of clouds than the ancient Greeks did. A really interesting kind of change that occurs not very often, but when it does, it's quite important, is coalescence. That's where you've got concepts you thought were previously really quite distinct, and you realize that they actually are basically the same thing. So with electromagnetism and then bringing light into the picture as well, realize, oh, that's all basically the same physical process. Or take arguments that went on for a long time about whether light was a wave or a particle, then people realize that, oh, well, you've got a kind of coalesced idea of wave-particle that goes into it. So coalescence is an interesting kind of conceptual change to watch for in any historical development like the brain revolution. But now let me tell you about, I think, the really exciting kinds of conceptual changes that have taken place in the history of science. They're rare, they really are part of revolutionary things, but I think they're going on right now in neuroscience, in the brain revolution. So the first one I'll call reclassification. In my book, Conceptual Revolutions, I called it branch jumping because the idea was you're going to have a tree of things, a whole bunch of kinds, and things get moved from one branch to another. But that didn't catch on, so I've just adopted in the last publications just reclassification as something that's more ordinary. But it's really important. I mean, think about the old Greek elements, 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, ether as well. Ether is gone. But the other 4 aren't gone. We still believe that there's earth, air, fire, and water. It's just that Greeks were completely wrong to think that they were elements. They're not elements. It turns out that earth and air are actually mixtures. So they got reclassified. They went from being elements to being mixtures. Water had a different reclassification. It went from being an element to being a compound once people figured out that water is H2O. Even more interesting, actually, is fire, because fire got reclassified not as an element, not as a mixture, but as a process. It's a process of rapid oxidation once Lavoisier developed the theory of oxidation. And this is, I think, going to be one of the most important things that's going on in neuroscience right now. Lots of things that were previously viewed as things or properties are being reclassified as process. This has happened previous times in the history of science. Heat, for example, was thought of, I already mentioned caloric, thought to be an element. But then in the 19th century, people figured out, oh, no, heat isn't actually an element. It's a process of molecules in motion. Same sort of thing with weight. Weight was thought to be a property of things. But then with Newton, it gets viewed as a process of interactions between different kinds of bodies. So these are major conceptual changes that I think are really important for understanding what's going on right now. The only one I didn't mention, which is one of the most important, and the reason I got a picture of Darwin up there, is the reclassification as humans as a kind of animal. This is one of the reasons why Darwin's theory, even today, draws lots of objections from some people, because previously, and in some current views, animals are one part of the tree, but humans are completely different. They originate through special creation, and they're just not animals. But Darwin changed the classification. He changed the taxonomy, so humans got brought under that. So these are all major kinds of conceptual change that take place by reclassification. The last kind I want to mention is probably the biggest, most radical change at all, and it happens very rarely. I think it's happening right now in the brain revolution, but at least let me tell you how it's happened historically. So what Darwin did was not just reclassify humans as animals, he changed the whole way in which classification gets done. because before that, in the Linnaean principles of classification, old biological taxonomy, animals and plants are classified based on what they look like, on their appearance. But for Darwin, the principle of classification became descent. It became where you were in that tree of descent. So evolution became the central principle. In the 20th century, late 20th century, once DNA got developed, or ways of measuring DNA, then you could use that as an additional biological way of tracing descent. So that was a shift, but the major shift was already the one that looked at historical descent as another key. A similar kind of meta-classification took place with the way in which you even think of classifying elements. Earth, air, fire, and water, how did the Greeks, or ether, how did they have that? Partly for theoretical reasons, partly what they looked like. But with modern physics, you get classification by atomic number. Once you have theories of protons and electrons, you can use that as the basis for thinking about how the elements should be classified. That's how we ended up with the 118 or whatever it is we have right now. Coming closer to biology, in the 19th century, starting with Pasteur's theory of infection, suddenly there's a dramatic change in the way in which you could classify diseases. I mean, in the 19th century, before Pasteur, fever was a disease. Well, we don't think of fever as a disease anymore. It's a symptom that you have to look at what are the different kinds of infections, bacterial or viral, lots of other diseases that aren't infectious discovered after Pasteur, nutritional diseases, autoimmune diseases. But the key thing is that in mainstream medicine, hasn't happened in psychiatry yet, although I think that's where we're headed, that disease classification isn't done by symptoms, it's done by causes. So this is a way of changing the way in which you do classification. In my earlier book, I called it tree switching because you're switching up the whole nature of the taxonomy. It's not just changing the taxonomy, it's changing the way you do the taxonomy. You're changing the tree, or meta-classification, as I now call it. So these are big kinds of conceptual change you want to look at in any major development, and we'll see how it works in respect to the brain. Okay. So is the brain revolution as revolutionary as some of these old ones like Darwin and Newton and Copernicus and Lavoisier and quantum theory as well? Well, certainly there's lots of changes, loads of new concepts. We've heard lots of them mentioned over the last couple of days. Neuron was a fairly new idea, not by Ramon y Cajal. He basically had the idea, but the term came a bit later. One of the most important ideas came by Donald Hebb in the 1940s, the idea of a cell assembly, what more commonly now is called a neural population or a neural group. It's the idea that you can have a representation carried out not by a single neuron, but by a group of neurons working together. So that's an important new term, but it's also an incredibly important new theoretical idea. Ideas of population codes, firing patterns already mentioned. One of the, I think, the best ideas to come out of 1980s style connectionism was the idea of parallel constraint satisfaction. Because the idea of inference that was standard in artificial intelligence coming out of formal logic was the idea of inference as a step-by-step procedure, but instead you can think of inference as lots of different neurons interacting in ways that satisfy a whole bunch of constraints at once, which is also a very powerful idea. Semantic pointer, a really new one, only 5 years old, popping in. The idea of the connectome is really important. So instead of just trying to do localism, as a bunch of people have talked about, try to use new kinds of mapping scanning techniques to try to figure out, well, what's the motion between different sorts of brain areas? And that's becoming quite useful to try to figure out what the connectome is. So instead of looking for localization, you're looking for connections between different brain areas. I actually think, now here this is really controversial. I decided that I'd err on the side of being provocative rather than cautious. So these are just suggestions about some things that I think deserve to be deleted or all being deleted. So from folk psychology, we definitely lose the soul and immortality. It's sort of sad to see immortality go. What did Willie Allen say? He said, I don't want immortality from my work, I want it from not dying. Well, that's a nice idea, but sorry. Those go, and actually I think free will goes as well, although that one's still controversial. With respect to analytic philosophy, I think there's a bunch of ideas that have been standard since the middle 20th century in philosophy of mind that are rendered obsolete. Ideas about propositional attitudes. Paul Churchland's argued that one is gone. Supervenience, I think, is not a useful idea. I much prefer an idea I'll talk about a bit more later, ideas about emergence. Modularity. Now this one's going to be really controversial. We've had lots of interesting talks about how much that can sustain, but I think that at least, even if it's not completely gone, it's certainly been shrunk way down to very specific cases. So with respect to analytic philosophy, I think that the brain revolution isn't as revolutionary as it is with respect to folk psychology, but still is problematic. With respect to information processing psychology, this one I'm still kind of sorting out because I haven't gone back to old cognitive psychology textbooks from the 70s and 80s, but at least some things aren't nearly as important as they used to be. So what was information in the early days of cognitive psychology? Well, it was supposed to be information in the sense of Shannon and Weaver. It was supposed to be a mathematical idea where you could actually quantify information in terms of bits. Well, people still talk about information, but nobody uses, I think, the Shannon and Weaver idea much anymore. People try to quantify things in terms of bits, important in computer science, but it's not so important in psychology. Psychology has kind of reverted to the common sense notion of information as something like representational content. Buffer, that did come up today. Maybe that's still around. It was really important as an idea brought over from computer science to describe things like memory. I don't think that's so important anymore. Idea of serial search was absolutely crucial to the Newell and Simon views, which were some of the first powerful ideas. And search is probably still around to some extent because you can think of memory search, but it's highly parallel. It's constructive in the way that people were talking about. But so serial search I don't think is important anymore. The idea of executive control and executive function are still around, but the idea of a central executive, which is running the brain the way a central processing unit runs things in a computer, that one is just gone. So these are at least some candidates of ideas from information processing psychology, which was incredibly important in knocking behaviorism out of the picture, but now seem to me to be on their way out. Okay, so that's deletion. What about differentiation? Here I think there are a lot of really interesting differentiations going on. One, I think, is a differentiation between digital computing and neural computing. So when the cognitive revolution took place in the 1950s and 60s, people said, oh, the mind is a computer. Well, I actually think the mind is a computer. I agree with that, except that it turns out that the way the brain computes is really different from the way that digital computers compute. So we need to there. Representation, I already alluded to one difference, the idea of representation being something that you can identify, like a word or like a clock or a picture. No, the idea of distributed representation is also really important. The idea that it can take a whole bunch of neurons, maybe millions of neurons, working together. I think that's an important distributed representation. Ways of thinking about change, I think, are really important. So there's simple kinds of changes, but emergence, I think, is an important way. And in a bunch of the work I've been working on with respect to emotions and mental illness, I think that we need an idea that's more complicated even than the usual idea of emergence, which is going from one level up to another. The things that are involved in complex human cognition, including emotions and depression and the self, involve interactions between lots of different kinds of mechanisms, at the molecular level, the neural level, psychological level, and in fact the social level, because a lot of the processes that we're dealing with, whether it's language or emotion, are very much social processes as well. Information, I already mentioned the shift from the Shannon mathematical view to a looser view that's more relevant. Consciousness, I think, isn't one of the ideas that I think should be deleted. There are people who want to delete the concept of consciousness. I think it's an important one, needs to be explained. But we can see it as operating in different ways, going from the very simple kind of conscious experience that perhaps exists in animals as simple as fish, more complicated sorts when you get animals who are able to actually bind the experience that, to a particular part, say having pain in the foot. More complicated ones that are found only in approximately 10 species so far identified, which is self-consciousness, awareness of self, usually shown by being able to recognize yourself in a mirror. That's down to 10 species. And then you get the most complicated kind of consciousness, which as far as I know is only found in people, which is the representation of self in society. You need this for very high-level social emotions such as shame or guilt. You have to have a sense of who you are in relation to your own society, and my hunch is that only occurs in humans. Okay, so we got differentiations in the immediate place. Coalescences, I'm not sure. I don't actually want to say that cognition and emotion are the same thing, but they look a lot more similar than they used to. I mean, it used to be the view, and you still hear this, people talk about, oh, there's the rational prefrontal cortex that's built on top of the old reptilian limbic system, which does emotions. This is all nuts. I mean, once you can start to map out the brain, you realize there are huge interconnections between the so-called limbic areas like the amygdala and all over the prefrontal cortex. And so cognition is thoroughly integrated with emotion, and according to the theory of emotion, I'll present emotion is also highly integrated with cognition. So you really want to think of this as an integrated system, rather than these being two entirely separate kinds of things. So that's my best candidate for a coalescence right now. I hope I can, or maybe you can suggest some better ones. Okay, now let's go to the really big changes. This is the idea of reclassification. This is what happens with Darwin, with Copernicus, with Newton, and so on. So the first one to notice is that mental representations aren't things like concepts, or like not things like states, but what they are is processes. So you've got lots of neurons interacting with each other. So they're not things, and this is going to apply to all the kinds of mental representations that I think are important for explaining what goes on in human thought. They include concepts, beliefs, rules, emotions, also images, also analogies, I think are a part of that as well. Meaning. People often talk of meaning as if it's a thing. You find that in the standard synonym that people use in philosophy. They talk about content. Well, content is a thing. And so what's the content of my glass? Well, it's water. Well, I don't think meaning is a content at all. It's a process. It's a process of interacting with lots of different things. So in the semantic pointer idea of meaning, it's interacting with the world, it's interacting with other symbols, and I think if you look at more broadly, it's interacting with other people, because linguistic meaning is a social process as well. So we need to shift to think of meaning as a process. Self, I've argued in a fairly recent paper, should be viewed as a system of multi-level mechanisms. This can be viewed mechanistically, but you've got to look at lots of different kinds of mechanisms that are involved with it. Simple things like habits. So the idea of habit's been around forever, and actually, William James and long before, as an idea of associations. But I think that with semantic pointers, you can interpret it differently. And so maybe you have the habit tied in with what I said. If you meet somebody new, then shake their hands. Well, that's not just a simple association. That's a rule that says, if you have a certain kind of visual and emotional experience, then produce a certain kind of motor action. And so the multimodal rule idea gives a different understanding of what habits are. So you get different kinds of reclassifications going on as part of what makes the brain revolution actually revolutionary. This part I'm not so sure about is metaclassification going on under the brain revolution. This one maybe it's too soon to say, but here's at least a couple of hints what I think are going on. Are there ways of changing how we classify things? Not just changing our classifications, but changing our whole methods of classifications. The one clear case where this is going on right now, or people hope it's going on, is changing classifications of mental illnesses based on causes rather than symptoms. So psychiatry finally catch up to what happened in the 19th century, which you can actually try to figure out not just by the symptoms that go into the DSM, but use things like the NIMH research data and domain criteria. So that hasn't happened yet because we just don't have good enough theories yet of the causes of different mental illnesses. But once that happens, we could well end up with different disease categories, but also more importantly, we're in the swing of seeing a change in the way in which the classification is made. So that's definitely going on. What I'm not sure is happening or not, I think some of the empirical work that people were pointing to at this workshop point toward it, is that we'll have different ways of classifying mental processes based on interactions of brain areas that could well go beyond ideas about folk psychology and localization. But again, it's too soon to figure out how that's going to sort out. But I think that's something to look forward to in the next 10 years of work on experimental and theoretical work in neuroscience, so that we just come up with a different way of classifying mental phenomena. One thing to watch out for, though, is something that's actually been fairly common in philosophy that I'll call premature elimination. This is cases where people look at the current state of things and they say, wow, that field is just so disorganized that we should get rid of that idea. One way people often put it is by saying, it's not a natural kind. which I actually don't use that terminology because I think it's a bit arcane. But it's important to figure out what your theoretical concept should be. And there are various prominent people. I started with David Hume up there who want to get rid of the concept of the self. Daniel Dennett, Metzinger also try to get rid of it. Macquarie says the concept of concepts is such a mess we should get rid of it. People have been skeptical about the whole idea of mental representation. Maybe we don't need that if we've got embodiment. One great thing about the semantic pointer hypothesis is that we get to have embodiment and mental representations. Griffiths suggested emotions should be knocked out of the scientific category. I think in all these cases we can retain them as theoretical concepts that are valuable for two reasons. First of all, they contribute to the best explanation of many phenomena. So in addition to that 2014 paper on the self, I've got a more recent one co-authored with a social psychologist where we look at 80 different phenomena about the self. And there's more than, and if you look at social and clinical psychology, there's more than 80 different phenomena, everything from self-esteem to self-control to self-knowledge. I mean, if Hume and others were wrong that there is no self, what do you make of those ideas? Well, I think you need it, and you can then do the other thing you want to do, which is to look for the underlying mechanisms. And so my account of the mechanisms underlying the self fit very nicely with the fact that the self plays a big explanatory role in lots of social phenomena. So we shouldn't toss it out. We shouldn't toss out concepts for the reason I did, or mental representations, or emotions for the reasons that I'll explain fairly shortly. And of course, consciousness falls under this as well. I think consciousness has got lots of development that's needed, but it's got underlying mechanisms. I got a 2014 paper that presents a semantic pointer theory of consciousness, which tries to justify that. So, let's talk about emotion. I'll have to go through this fairly briefly, but it will give you a sense that's not nearly as broad of what goes on. So what are emotions? Kristen gave a really nice presentation of some of the fascinating experimental work that shows that there really is a need to rethink it. What I'm going to talk about now is consistent with her general constructivist approach, but tries to specify more in detail in terms of neural mechanisms. But that's not the common sense view of emotion. The common sense view is that emotion is a property of non-material souls. Well, I mentioned the happy in hell or happy in hell. I don't think that happens. Maybe for masochists, I don't know. So happy in heaven or sad in hell. No evidence for that one, but the other main theories of where emotions come from have all had a certain degree of plausibility. Not because any one of them is right, because I think they're all pointing to aspects of what goes into the psychological process of emotion. So one idea that's been around actually since the Greek Stoics, is still very popular with philosophers like Martha Nussbaum, is the idea that emotion is a cognitive appraisal. And so you're evaluating your current situation with respect to your goals. So if you're enjoying the workshop, you're happy to be here, and your goal is to learn things about the brain and philosophy, then it fits. The situation makes you happy because it fits with your goals. But the other view that's been mentioned here is that no, emotions are actually physiological processes. Started with William James and lots of other people, both in philosophy and psychology, have endorsed this view, that it's changes that are taking place in not just your heartbeat and your breathing rate and your skin response and your gut feelings, but also your facial expressions, also your body language. These are all things that are contributing physiologically to your emotions. I know, and another view, which is I think partly right, which is that emotion is also something that's subject to linguistic and social control, because you find different emotions as more important in some cultures rather than others. Well, I don't think 2, 3, and 4 are actually alternative theories. This is obviously an eternal alternative to the non-naturalist view in number 1, but 2, 3, and 4 actually I think are just pointing to parts of emotions, and semantic pointers showed how to put it all together. So the view that Tobias Schroeder and I developed of emotions as semantic pointers, so far there's only just a sketch of it in a little chapter in a book, but we've got a much larger paper underway where we take the semantic pointer architecture and build computer models of some really interesting phenomena about emotions and show how you can put all these things together in a mechanistic form that yields the result that you want. So from this point of view, what's an emotion? Well, it's a result of binding. It's a semantic pointer, which is going to bind a bunch of things together, but it's binding a representation of the situation, which could be a concept or a belief. For example, your belief or any kind of representation of where you are right now. some kind of representation, the cognitive appraisal, which is how is this relevant to my goals, but also the physiological perception. So once you've got a brain process that is operating in parallel, the way everything in the brain does, you can put these things all together. You don't have to consider them as just serial parts of what goes on. They can all be bound together in the same way in perception. People used to argue, is perception top-down or bottom-up? Well, the answer is it's both, because the brain as a parallel processor is able to put it all together. So why are you happy to be in London or in Paris? I think I first used this slide in Paris. Well, because you can bind your representation of Paris. And remember, the representation of Paris doesn't have to be just verbal. It can also be what Paris looks like or smells like or tastes like, and what you're doing in Paris. That all can be part of your representation of Paris. With the appraisal, and I've got an old model of appraisal going back from a 2008 paper on emotional consciousness that treats appraisal not as a serial kind of step-by-step evaluation of the situation with respect to your goals, but as parallel constraint satisfaction. It can all be done all at once, working with the parallel processes in the brain. And of course, also in parallel is various reports going to the brain for what's happening to the physiology, including simultaneously what's happening in your face, in your gut, and your skin, and your heart rate, and your cortisol levels, and so on. So all of these things are patterns of neural firing that get bound by this great mathematical operation that now runs in neurons into the semantic pointers and part of the semantic pointer architecture in ways that are mathematically precise and easy to simulate. Okay, so that's what I think emotions are. Let me give you a more concrete example. Here, this shows the semantic pointer emotion. It could be something happiness or sadness or fear, anger, disgust. It can even be more complicated kinds of things. I just did a study of the causes of the First World War, and really interesting emotions cropped up in that. I mean, why did Germany and Austria run into situations that were disastrous for them? Well, the historian I was looking at described them as having the leaders as having a very complex emotion I'd never even heard of before, fear of humiliation. So they kept escalating because of fear of humiliation. Maybe you haven't had that one, but I bet everyone here has had fear of embarrassment. And so you can have these kinds of emotions about emotions. The nice thing about semantic pointer ideas is because you can have not only bindings, but you can have bindings of bindings of bindings. And so you can move up into more and more complicated kinds of representations. But in the simple case, you've got representation of the situation, and the physiology, and the appraisal. And in the case of humans, or the few other species that seem to have a representation of self, you can bind yourself into that as well. So let me give you a concrete example of that. So what does sadness? Well, there's not sadness in general. It might be sadness about rejection. So imagine that in that story I told you at the beginning where you got the man in the movie, he's really interested in the dog and especially interested in the woman. So he chases after her and said, "Hey, would you like to get a cup of coffee?" And she goes, "Huh." Okay. So he's rejected. Why is he sad? Well, he's got a representation of the situation, which is sensory and verbal. It's appraisal. He's realizing that his goal of having love in his life is gone. Physiology, with sadness, you have a lower heart rate, and motor things, which is a tendency to withdraw. And so sadness can be understood as this amalgam by convolution of various kinds of inputs going into this higher level representation called a semantic pointer. So what does this do with conceptual change? Well, here, this is all fairly tentative because the theory of emotions is fairly new, but here I'm kind of guessing. So what's happening to the theory of emotions with respect to conceptual change or taxonomic change if the semantic pointer theory of emotions is right? A bunch of things. First of all, we've got addition of new concepts, such as semantic pointers that wasn't part of any previous theory of emotions. Of course, we take over lots of ideas that have been around for a long time, ideas that involve linguistic and social construction, ideas about appraisal, ideas about physiology. We put them all together in a new package using semantic pointers. We also have the capability, as I mentioned, of dealing with these nested emotions about emotions, like fear of humiliation. What gets deleted? Well, I think one thing that gets deleted is the standard way that philosophers talk about emotions as propositional attitudes. Being happy to be in Paris is supposed to be a relation between some kind of abstract self and an abstract entity called the proposition, which is the meaning of sentences. I don't think we need that kind of idea anymore. That one's gone. I also think, in line with what Krista was saying yesterday, ideas about basic emotions, that a few emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, anger, and disgust run as special purpose programs in the brain, probably can be deleted as well. Differentiation. Very interesting sorts of differentiations take place. We can certainly see, for example, with respect to kinds of emotions, that there is a big difference between simple emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, anger that are probably held by lots of other mammals at least, probably birds also, but social emotions that human beings are capable of, things like fear and, not fear, but shame and guilt and embarrassment and pride and gratitude. This really does require you to have a complex representation of yourself in respect to other people. So what's the difference with these cases is that there you really need to have more complex bindings, bindings of bindings and bindings. And this binding process, this convolution process, takes lots of neurons. Humans can do it because we've got lots more neurons. So that's a kind of differentiation. Wanting versus liking is interesting differentiation made by Kent Barrett based on actually neuroanatomy. He thinks that, if I got it right, liking is more a process that involves dopamine activity. No, I got it wrong. Okay, that's opioid activity in the ventral pallidum, is that right? And wanting is the dopamine activity in nucleus accumbens. Well, so that wasn't a distinction that you find in ordinary speech, but he's looking at the neural circuitry, thinking that should be distinguished. Another interesting distinction that I think is important of different kinds of empathy. Many people have talked about the importance of empathy in human interactions. It's now part of the whole theory of emotional intelligence and theories of leadership. Okay, 2 minutes. But I actually think there are 3 different processes involved in empathy. One of them is a basic analogical process. Put somebody else in shoes and you do a kind of analogical inference. That can be done quite verbally. Another is a very simple one where you just simply have mirror neuron reactions. I used to have it when my kids were running around. They trip and fall and I go, ugh. Well, that could be a mirror neuron sort of empathy. But there's a third sort that I've just realized that I think it needs to be understood in terms of semantic pointers. So I mentioned that semantic pointers can involve these complicated multimodal rules where it's not if this then that, where this and that are things that are verbal. They can be sensory, motor, and emotional. So I think what goes on in this complicated kind of empathy, where you can have a feeling for how other people are feeling by running your own multimodal rules about emotional reactions and get a rich nonverbal sense of what somebody else is feeling. So that we can get 3 different kinds of empathy instead of one that's not understood at all in terms of cognitive processes. Here you get 3 kinds of empathy, all of which can be understood as neural processes. Okay, other kinds, coalescence, I already mentioned cognitive emotion and maybe abandoning the distinction of basic versus derivative emotions. Reclassifications, well, big things going on here, thinking of emotions as neural processes rather than as abstract entities, thinking of them as resulting from multi-level emergence, which is the whole complex of molecular, neural, psychological, social causes. This one I'm not sure about at all. I mean, is there meta-classification of emotions going on? I'd love to have some suggestions about that. Are we in the position to be able to change the way in which we classify emotions? I think this could well happen, but it hasn't happened obviously yet because there's a kind of folk taxonomy of emotions that you can find in WordNet or in an emotion ontology that they produced in Buffalo. But maybe that needs to change. It's just not clear how that's going to come out because we're still developing theories of emotions. So let me wrap it all up. So my main claims are, first of all, that brain science is in fact revolutionary with respect especially to folk psychology, but quite possibly lots of other theories of mind as well. It alters folk and psychological taxonomies in important ways. Fundamental concepts like concept and emotion don't have to be thrown out. They would simply require reclassification. We have to think of them in terms of neural processes and figure out what the neural processes are, which of course requires change in our view of neural process. The experimental work is great to be able to track what's happening in different parts of the brain, but we also need the theoretical work to try to figure out how these neurons are doing in those cases. And it's entirely possible that not only is reclassification going on, but at least, especially with respect to mental disorders, and quite possibly with mental processes, we've got metaclassification as yet another major kind of conceptual change that's occurring right now. Thank you.
Owen, can you start setting up as soon as possible, because so we don't have much time for questions. Tim?
Yeah, Paul. So I'm interested in the question of re-identifying concepts across people, across epochs, across different theoretical frameworks. If that looks like one thing we want to do. We want to be able to say when people are using the same word to pick up the same concept, or they're using words to pick up different concepts. And it sounds like the semantic pointer view embraces a kind of holism, which makes it a little bit difficult to do that. I mean, if all the elements of your semantic pointer associated with fire are part of the identity conditions of that concept, presumably the elements, when Aristotle uses the term fire, or the Greek equivalent of fire, when I use it, they're going to be different. Yeah. So one wants to say, presumably it can't be the case that all of those elements are essential to the concept, because then you don't share a concept with Aristotle, and now we're really...
Okay, first of all, you got to get rid of a couple of the ways you described it in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions and essences, because that's part of the old theory of concepts that isn't empirically adequate.
I didn't use those terms.
You talked about essences, and you talked about...
I talked about identity conditions.
Identity conditions, the same thing. That's necessary and sufficient conditions, I presume. So don't think of it that way. Think of it more in terms of prototypes and exemplars. But now we got the question, what is there in common between, say, our concept of fire and Aristotle's? Some of it's really different, obviously, because we think of fire...
Aristotle's concept of what?
Of fire. Yeah. Okay.
That's,
but now what's in common?
that's the point. Why there's the point?
Okay, so now why, yeah, all right, but let me give you the answer. It's actually in my 2014 paper on explanatory identities. This is where it's really useful to have the semantic pointer idea of concepts, because it's not just a purely word-to-word relation. Our concept of fire also involves heat and the visual stuff, and we have every reason to believe that our brains work the same way as Aristotle. There hasn't been major evolution of brains since then. So at least the sensory motor stuff is pretty much the same, and that provides us with sufficient grounds to think that there's some overlap between Aristotle's concept of fire and ours.
So I think what you're doing, if I can suggest this, is you're using the world rather. You're using fire as it were, something in the environment to anchor re-identification of the term across different theoretical frameworks. And insofar as you're doing that, you're going outside the brain. You're basically got an externalist account of concepts when you make that move.
No, this kind of concept is simultaneously internalist and externalist, because you've got both the internal processes of symbol-to-symbol relations, and of course the connections to the world that you get through sensory motor. So both, you want to have both. I guess.
Is that a question?
Sure.
Yep.
On the slide, which we unfortunately can't see, you're talking about non-constructive theoretical concepts. What do you mean by theoretical concept as opposed to concept?
Oh, this is a standard distinction in philosophy of science. So we have observable concepts, things like table and chair, we can see with our ordinary senses. But there are lots of concepts in science that are really important that go beyond the senses. Things like gene and virus and electron and quark and black hole. So these are all things that aren't directly observable, but science knows they're really important because they provide underlying mechanisms for explaining what is observable. So that's what I meant by theoretical concepts.
Yeah, just it seems as though some things you're putting in that category I would interpret as perhaps not having explanatory power as far as the usage goes.
Like what?
Especially like folk psychology terms that are so muddy in definition of usage, they're really not really distinct.
Yeah, so soul is a theoretical concept. It turns out to be one that refers to nothing. And that happens as science changes and culture changes. You realize that your old theoretical concepts were wrong.
But even things like consciousness or incognition uses so many different usages, but it becomes problematic as far as that concept itself providing explanation.
We'll take one more quick question from Kristen.
So, thank you very much. I really love this talk. You talked about multi-level emergence across sort of levels of analysis. And I'm wondering to what extent you think there's emergence within your semantic pointer. So to what extent is the semantic pointer an emergent product
Oh, very much. So there's all sorts of layers of emergence going on. Even think of what happens in a particular neuron. So the neuron has an emergent property, namely spiking. So the parts of a neuron are all the different kinds of molecules that go into it. They don't spike. When you have them interacting and you build up the voltage, then the neuron spikes. So that's already an emergent property. And then when you move to what we have called cell assemblies, we now call neural populations, you've got the ability to have complex representations. So you've got a whole bunch of neurons working together, where representation is a property not of the individual neurons, but of their interactions. And so you've got emergence there. In the case of semantic pointers, you've got representations of representations, so you have emergence that involves binding of all these other things, and so you get something even more complicated. So yeah, so there's at least 3 levels of emergence going on there.
Okay, we're gonna move right on into the next talk, so very shortly we'll